He didn't know the girl's name when he threw himself in front of her. He only knew that someone was going to have to bleed, and he decided it was going to be him. That's the kind of man Patrick Lane was. Not a hero by any stretch of the word he would have used to describe himself. He drove a 2009 Ford F-150 with a cracked left taillight he kept meaning to fix. He packed his son's lunch every morning at 6:15, made the same turkey and mustard sandwich. No crust because Tucker refused to eat the crust, and somehow at 44 years old, Patrick still couldn't say no to that. He worked the overnight shift at a downtown parking garage on Mercer Street, Thursday through Monday, 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., guarding a concrete structure that smelled like exhaust and old rain and never gave him a single moment of excitement in the 4 years he'd worked there. That was the point. After everything Patrick Lane had been through, quiet was not just acceptable. Quiet was the goal. Quiet meant Tucker was sleeping safely down the hall. Quiet meant the bills were paid, mostly. Quiet meant that the version of himself that used to move fast and react faster, the version trained in forward operating bases in places he didn't talk about anymore, could finally just rest. But the quiet was always a negotiation. And on the night of November the 14th, the other party stopped negotiating. It started the way a lot of bad things start, with something small that almost didn't register. Patrick was doing his 11:30 walkthrough of Level 3, the one he'd done 400 times without incident. His footsteps echoed off the bare concrete, his flashlight cutting a narrow path ahead of him. The garage was empty that late on a Thursday, just a handful of cars left by people who'd taken cabs home from the restaurant district below. He heard it before he saw it. A sound, not quite a cry, not quite a word. Something caught between the two. The kind of sound that a person makes when they've been told to stay quiet, but terror overrules the instruction. It came from a stairwell at the northeast corner of Level 3, the one that opened onto the alley behind Hargrove Place. Patrick stopped walking. He'd learned a long time ago to trust that particular instinct, the one that turns your skin cold before your brain catches up to why. He stood still for exactly 2 seconds, and then he moved. What he found in that stairwell was a girl. She was maybe 8 or 9 years old, small, wearing a cream-colored dress that belonged at a school recital, not in a parking garage at midnight. She had blonde hair pulled into a braid that was coming loose, and her eyes, when his flashlight found them, with a kind of wide that goes past scared and into something closer to shut down. She was pressed against the concrete wall between the stairwell door and a gray utility panel, her knees pulled to her chest, her fingers white-knuckled around her own wrists. Standing over her was a man Patrick had never seen before. He was big, not prison yard big, but train body big, the kind that comes from a structured program and expensive equipment. He was wearing all black, tactical pants, a fleece jacket, boots with no laces that Patrick immediately registered as someone who'd learned to dress for fast movement. There was a communications earpiece in his right ear, and he had one hand extended toward the girl, palm up, in the universal gesture of "come with me right now." Patrick said, "Hey." Just that. Just one word. But it landed in that stairwell like a stone dropped into still water, and everything rippled. The man in black straightened up and turned, and in the half-second before his expression settled into controlled neutral, Patrick caught something raw across his face. Surprise, maybe. Irritation, definitely. And underneath both of those, something that Patrick's nervous system recognized even when his conscious mind was still processing. Calculation. "Sir," the man said, his voice professionally even, "this is a private matter. You should continue your rounds." Patrick looked at the girl. The girl looked at Patrick. Her lips moved. No sound came out, but he could read it. 2 syllables. "Please help." "I don't think I'm going to do that," Patrick said. What happened next took 11 seconds. Patrick knew because he counted afterward the way he always counted after things went physical, a habit from training that never fully left. The man came at him fast and with purpose, which told Patrick this wasn't the first time he needed to remove an inconvenience. Patrick had a 6-inch height disadvantage and about 30 pounds on the man, but he had something the man didn't seem to expect. He had done this for real, in real conditions, for real stakes, and the man in black, for all his training, had probably never done anything that wasn't scripted. 11 seconds. Patrick took a cut to his left forearm from the edge of tactical blade. He felt it more as heat than pain, the way bad injuries sometimes announce themselves, and then the man was down on the landing floor, breathing but not moving, and Patrick was standing over him with his own blood beginning to warm the inside of his sleeve. He looked at the girl. She hadn't moved. She was still against the wall, still white-knuckled, still staring. "My name is Patrick," he said, keeping his voice low and even the same way he used to talk to his son after Tucker's nightmares. "I'm not going to hurt you. Are you okay? Can you walk?" A long pause. Then the girl nodded, once slow, like she was checking to make sure her head still worked. "Good," Patrick said. "We're going to move. Stay right behind me." He didn't ask her name yet. He didn't ask anything yet. There would be time for questions if they got out of this stairwell. He pressed his right hand briefly against the cut on his forearm, deep but not arterial, his brain logged automatically, then unclipped his radio from his belt and switched it off. If whoever this man worked for was monitoring security frequencies, Patrick wasn't going to announce their position. He pushed open the door to the alley. And the night outside was cold and quiet and wet with a rain that had stopped an hour earlier, cobblestones glistening under the amber wash of distant streetlights. And Patrick scanned left, right, the length of the alley between Hardgrove Place and the back of the parking structure. And for exactly 3 seconds, he let himself think that maybe that was it. Maybe there was one man in a bad situation, and the worst of it was already on the floor of the stairwell. He would remember those 3 seconds later and think about how dangerous hope can be when you're in the middle of something that isn't finished. Because that's when he heard the radios. Not his radio. He'd switched that off. Other radios. Multiple. Carrying voices with the flat, clipped cadence of people who communicate under pressure for a living. Coming from both ends of the alley. He couldn't see them yet. The alley was long, and the mist and the amber light blurred the distance. But he could hear the static-chased voices, and he could see the narrow beams of tactical flashlights beginning to slice through the haze from the north end. And from the south, the rumble of an engine idling. Patrick pressed himself against the brick wall and pulled the girl in front of him, putting his body between her and the open alley. He could feel her shaking, a fine, constant tremor, like a phone set to vibrate. "It's okay," he breathed. "I've got you." There were things Patrick Lane did not understand in that moment. He didn't understand who this girl was or why a team of tactical men in black were moving through a downtown alley at midnight looking for her. He didn't understand what he'd walked into or how deep it went or what the man on the stairwell landing was going to do when he woke up and made his report. But there was one thing he understood with complete and total clarity. Nobody was taking this child anywhere while he was standing up. Now, to understand how a parking garage security guard from Spokane, Washington ends up bleeding in a downtown alley with a billionaire's daughter while 15 armed security operatives close in from both sides, you have to understand a few things about Patrick Lane's life. Not the dramatic parts, the quiet parts, because the quiet parts are what built the man who made the choices he made that night. Patrick grew up in Boise, Idaho, the second of 3 boys in a house where the heat sometimes didn't work in January and the cable bill was always the first thing that got cut when money ran short. His father worked construction. His mother worked the morning shift at a hospital cafeteria and the evening shift at a dry cleaner's, and Patrick grew up understanding, without anyone ever saying it explicitly, that the world required effort and you either gave it or you fell behind. He enlisted at 19, not for any grand patriotic reason. He'd tell you that honestly, with no apology. He enlisted because his older brother had done it and come back with direction and discipline and purpose, and Patrick wanted those things too. He went a basic. He was good at it. He was noticed for being good at it. And within 2 years, he was doing things that weren't on the brochure. He did 2 tours. He came back the second time with a small scar under his left eye from a vehicle incident outside Kandahar, a recurring knot in his right shoulder that no amount of physical therapy had ever fully resolved, and a complete and total inability to sleep more than 4 hours at a stretch for the next 3 years. He also came back to Helen. Helen Strickland had been a year behind him in school, back in Boise. She was precise and organized in the way that some people are when they've grown up with chaos and decided that order is a form of self-defense. She was an accountant, genuinely good at it, the kind of good that comes from loving the logic of it, not just the paycheck. She had a way of cutting through noise that Patrick had admired from the first time he'd sat across from her at a card table at a mutual friend's backyard gathering in July 2003. He'd said something fumbling and she'd laughed, not at him, but like she appreciated the effort, and that was it. He was decided. They married in 2005. Tucker was born in 2009. They moved to the Pacific Northwest in 2011 when Helen took a senior auditing position at a company called Faulkner Defense Systems, a mid-sized defense contractor headquartered in Seattle. The work was good. The money was better than it had ever been. They bought a house in a suburb with decent schools and a park within walking distance, and Patrick got his contractor's license and did home renovation work while Tucker was small, and for about 3 years, 3 genuinely good years, the life Patrick Lane had quietly wanted since boyhood was sitting right there in his hands. There was one thing he noticed in the last year of those 3 years. Helen started bringing work home. Not in the normal way. She'd always done that. The laptop open on the kitchen table after Tucker went to bed, coffee going cold beside it. This was different. This was quieter. She would close her laptop when he walked into the room, not in a guilty way, but in the way of someone who is protecting something they haven't fully figured out yet. She started asking him questions about document storage, about encrypted email, about who you'd contact if you found something at a company that you weren't supposed to know about. He'd asked her once, directly, what was going on. She'd looked at him for a long moment, and then said, "I'm not sure yet. Let me be sure first." He'd let it go. He shouldn't have let it go. On a Wednesday morning in March of 2021, Helen Lane was driving Tucker to school. Patrick had had a late job the night before, and she'd offered, when a box truck ran a red light at the intersection of Crestview and Maple and hit the driver's side of their car at 43 miles per hour. Tucker walked away with a broken collarbone. Helen did not walk away. The police report called it driver error. The box truck driver had no prior record, was apologetic, was tested for alcohol and drugs, and came back clean. It was, the investigating officer told Patrick with genuine sorrow in his voice, just a terrible accident. One of those things that happens. Patrick had sat in a plastic chair in a hospital waiting room for 6 hours before they told him. And when they finally did, he didn't cry. He went very still, the way he'd been trained to go still when a situation had no immediately actionable solution, and he sat there in that stillness for a long time. He left Faulkner Defense Systems' employment area behind. Helen's company, her professional world, her people. He left Seattle. He moved himself and Tucker to a 2-bedroom apartment in downtown Spokane and got the parking garage job because it was nights, and left his days free for Tucker's school pickups and parent-teacher nights and the slow, grinding work of being the only parent in a house that used to have 2. He never thought about Faulkner Defense Systems again. Not once. Until the night in the alley. But we'll come back to that. Because right now you need to understand something else. Something that was happening miles away from that alley, while Patrick was still eating his 7 p.m. meal before his shift, while he was texting Tucker's sitter to confirm she was set, while he was changing into his gray uniform shirt in the bathroom of his apartment, completely unaware that the next 12 hours were going to rearrange everything he thought he knew about the worst day of his life. His name was Richard Faulkner. He was 52 years old, silver-haired, with the kind of physical leanness that comes not from genetics, but from the discipline of a man who controls everything, including himself. He ran Faulkner Defense Systems with a precision that had made him worth roughly $4.2 billion by most estimates, and a reputation in the defense contracting world as a man who did not lose, not deals, not negotiations, and not legal battles. He was currently in the middle of one. The federal government had launched an investigation into Faulkner Defense Systems 6 months prior, centered around a series of contract irregularities. Specifically, allegations that the company had been systematically overbilling the Department of Defense on a procurement contract worth $800 million. The lead investigator, a woman named Special Agent Dana Pruitt out of the DOJ's Fraud Division, had been building a case quietly and methodically. Faulkner's legal team was fighting it, expensively and aggressively, but there were documents, internal auditing documents, the kind that came from someone inside the company, that if they made it to trial, would make the case essentially unwinnable. Documents that, 3 years ago, had been in the possession of a senior auditor named Helen Lane. What Patrick did not know, what the police in Seattle had never known, and what Richard Faulkner had spent 3 years making sure no one would ever know, was that the box truck that killed his wife had not run a red light by accident. The driver had been paid. The accident had been arranged. The documents Helen had been compiling, the evidence of a fraud scheme that would have put Richard Faulkner in federal prison, had been confiscated from her home office within 48 hours of her death, removed by a man named Bryce Morrow under the cover of a so-called HR-sensitive document retrieval, a procedure Faulkner's lawyers had invented specifically for that moment. And for 3 years, the arrangement had held. Then Dana Pruitt's investigation had turned up a secondary paper trail. Old server backups, archived emails on a government contractor's Exchange server that hadn't been wiped in time. Faulkner's legal exposure had crept back to the edge of critical, and he had made a decision. He needed a distraction, a big one, the kind that occupied headlines and generated public sympathy and painted him not as a fraudster, but as a victim, a father. His daughter Grace was 9 years old. She spent alternating weeks with him and with her mother, Faulkner's ex-wife, Lorraine, who had no knowledge of any of this and lived in a townhouse in Bellingham. And on the week she was with Richard Faulkner, she was kept in a penthouse apartment on the 23rd floor of a downtown Seattle high-rise, supervised by a rotating team of household staff that included, at various times, a private tutor, a cook, a nanny, and 2 full-time residential security personnel. The plan Faulkner had built with Bryce Morrow, his head of private security, a former federal contractor who'd gone private 8 years ago and had never once let ethics get in the way of a paycheck, was clean in its broad strokes. Grace would be abducted on the night of November 14th. She would be taken by a trusted operative, held in comfort at a secondary location, and returned unharmed within 72 hours after Faulkner's public grief and cooperation with law enforcement had generated enough media saturation to fundamentally reframe his public image from accused fraudster to beloved father. The operative who took Grace would receive $250,000 and a clean exit. Bryce Morrow would receive his standard arrangement, and Richard Faulkner would emerge from the episode as a man the American public felt sorry for, not suspicious of. The plan had exactly one variable that Morrow had noted and Faulkner had dismissed. The girl would have to be kept calm. Grace Faulkner was not calm. She had woken up to a man she'd never seen before standing in her bedroom doorway. And whatever story he had tried to tell her, that her father had arranged this, that she needed to come quietly, had not landed the way Morrow's operative had scripted it. She had run. She had gotten further than anyone expected. She had made it down 22 flights of the building's service stairs, out through a ground floor utility exit, and into the parking garage on Mercer Street, where she had pressed herself into a stairwell corner and prayed for something to change. And Patrick Lane had walked around a corner with a flashlight. Now he was in the alley with a deep cut in his left forearm, one unconscious operative behind him, and the sound of multiple teams closing the distance from both ends of the lane. He could count at least 4 flashlight beams from the north approach. More from the south. He couldn't be precise, but his instinct said the same number, maybe more. He had Grace pressed in front of him, his body between her and the open alley, one hand on her shoulder to keep her steady. His other hand had found a makeshift pressure against his forearm. He'd torn a strip from the hem of his uniform shirt and wrapped it tight. Not elegant, but functional. The blood had slowed from urgent to manageable. Good enough. Do you have a phone? He asked her, barely a whisper. She shook her head. He'd already established that his own phone had gone dead sometime in the previous 40 minutes. Battery had been at 11% when his shift started, and the fight in the stairwell had burned through whatever was left. His radio was still off. He had no communication. He looked up at the walls of the alley. Brick on both sides, 3 stories. No fire escapes on this stretch. No doors except the one they'd come through, which now had a waking operative on the other side of it. He looked right, then left, measuring the closing distance against the speed at which he could move with a 9-year-old in tow. And then he saw the recess. About 40 feet down the alley to his left, just south of where the flashlights were approaching from the south end, there was a utility alcove cut into the brick wall. It was the kind of recess you see in older downtown buildings, originally built to hold electrical junction boxes and building infrastructure. It was maybe 5 feet deep and 3 feet wide, partially screened by a dumpster that had been pushed to the left side of the alley by whoever had made a delivery that week. It wasn't good cover. It wasn't what he would have chosen, but it was between him and the Southern team, which meant taking it required moving toward one threat while the other closed from behind. It meant timing. It meant speed. And it meant that if the dumpster's position didn't screen the alcove as well as it looked from 40 feet away, he would be standing in plain sight of a team of 10 armed men with a child in front of him. He thought about it for exactly the amount of time he had to spare, which was less than 3 seconds. Then he picked up Grace. She was light, lighter than Tucker at 9, and she didn't resist, just wrapped her arms around his neck with the silent trust of a child who has no better option, and he moved. He cleared the 40 feet in the longest 7 seconds of his recent life, keeping his body low, Grace pressed against his chest, his injured arm screaming in a way that had graduated from manageable to significant as he bore weight on it. He reached the dumpster, pressed himself flat against the brick, slid sideways into the recess, pulled Grace in front of him and put his back to the wall and tried to make both of them as small as physics would allow. The Southern team's flashlights swept the alley. One beam passed not 6 inches from the left edge of the dumpster. Patrick did not breathe. Grace, to her credit, and he would think about this later, about how remarkable she was, did not make a sound. The beam moved on. The team passed. He counted boots on cobblestone, counted 7 distinct pairs, which told him the Southern team was 7 men minimum. The Northern team, still closing, would meet them somewhere in the middle. 14 men, minimum, plus the one waking up in the stairwell. And they were in communication. He could hear the radio traffic, fragmented and cryptic, but the rhythm of it was familiar. They were coordinating a grid search. They knew roughly where he was, but not exactly. Here's the thing about grid searches that most people don't know. They're methodical, and methodical means predictable. Patrick had run enough of them years ago to know that the 2-minute window between the initial sweep and the return sweep was real and consistent. If he was going to move, it had to be in that window. And it had to be towards something, not just away from the teams, but toward an exit, a phone, a person who could change the equation. He thought about the building at the south end of the alley. He'd walked past it hundreds of times during shift walkthroughs. It was a hotel, the Carlisle, 12 stories, lobby open 24 hours. A hotel lobby meant a desk phone. A desk phone meant a 911 call that couldn't be intercepted on a radio frequency. The south end of the alley was where the second team had come from, which meant they'd already cleared it, which meant for exactly the next 90 seconds, it was the safest place in the alley. He looked down at Grace. Even in the dark, he could see her watching him, not panicking, not shutting down, just watching, waiting to take her cue from him. "Can you run?" he asked. She nodded. Immediately. "No hosetaschen." Good kid, he thought. God, what a good kid. "Stay on my left side and don't let go of my hand," he said. "Don't look back. Don't stop. Whatever you hear, don't stop." "Can you do that?" "Yes," she whispered. First word she'd said to him. It was barely sound, but it was whole. "Okay," Patrick said. "Let's go." They ran. The cobblestones were slick from the earlier rain, and Patrick's boots had no grip left on the right heel. He'd been meaning to replace them. It was on the list behind the taillight and 24 other things. And twice he felt his footing go uncertain, and twice he corrected without slowing down, because slowing down was not available as an option. Grace ran with her hand in his, her small fingers locked around two of his, and she ran like she'd been told to and didn't look back. They hit the south end of the alley, and Patrick pulled up hard behind the corner of the building, pressing them flat against the brickwork, scanning the street beyond. Hargrove Place at midnight. A few distant cab headlights, a couple walking half a block north, the yellow glow of the Carlisle Hotel entrance 40 feet away. He could hear the grid search reforming behind them in the alley, the flashlight beams shifting, the radio chatter picking up, and he knew the 2-minute window was closing. "Walk," he told Grace. "Normal, like we're supposed to be here." She straightened up, took one breath, and walked beside him across the wet sidewalk toward the Carlisle's entrance as though she owned the building. He nearly laughed. He didn't, but he nearly did. The hotel lobby was warm and overlit in the way of places designed to feel welcoming at any hour, with marble floors and a flower arrangement on a central table that was too large for the space, and a young man behind the front desk who was reading something on his phone and didn't look up until Patrick was 3 feet from the counter. The young man looked up, took in Patrick's gray security shirt, the torn hem, the wrapped forearm with its darkening stain, the grip with which he was holding this small girl's hand. His face went through a sequence, confusion, alarm, a professional attempt to smooth both of those down. "Sir, I need your phone right now," Patrick said. "This is an emergency. There's a child who's been in danger. I need to call 911 immediately, and I need you to lock your front entrance. Do you understand me?" The young man, his name tag said Ryan, stared for exactly 2 seconds. Then he picked up the desk phone and handed it across the counter without a word. Patrick dialed. The call connected on the first ring. What Patrick told the 911 dispatcher in the next 4 minutes was precise and organized because he had been trained to make precise and organized reports under conditions that made precision and organization very difficult. He gave the location. He described the girl and her condition. He described the men in the alley, their number, their equipment, their direction of approach. He described his own injury. He asked, pointedly, whether the responding officers would be uniformed Spoken PD or something else, and the dispatcher, a calm woman who did not seem thrown by the question, confirmed uniformed officers and asked him to stay on the line. He stayed on the line. While he was on the line, Grace sat down on the marble floor with her back against the front desk. Not because anyone told her to, but because her legs had apparently decided they were done holding her up, and she was practical enough to accept that. And Ryan, the desk clerk, crouched beside her and asked if she was hurt. And she shook her head, and he asked if she wanted a glass of water, and she nodded. He got her water. She drank it with both hands around the glass like a much younger child. And Patrick watched her over the top of the desk phone and felt something in his chest pull tight in a way that had nothing to do with the cut on his arm. There was something about her face. He couldn't have said what it was exactly. It was just a quality, a specific arrangement of features, or maybe it was the composure under pressure, or maybe it was the way she'd said yes in that alley without wavering. Something that nagged at the edge of his recognition like a word he couldn't quite recall. He filed it away. He had other things to deal with. The police arrived in 11 minutes. 2 squad cars for officers. Patrick buzzed them through the locked entrance. Ryan had, bless him, actually engaged the door lock as instructed, and met them at the threshold with his hands visible and his ID out, the way a man who knows how these things work makes sure not to become a problem for the people he needs on his side. The lead officer was a woman in her mid-40s, dark hair pulled back, with the kind of unhurried competence that comes from doing the job long enough to have seen most of it. Her name tag said Officer K. Strom. She looked at Patrick. She looked at Grace. She looked at Patrick's arm. "Let's get you both inside and seated," she said. "Right now, before anything else, is the child hurt?" "She's not hurt," Patrick said. "She's okay." Officer Strom knelt in front of Grace with a particular quality of stillness that good police officers use with scared children. Not smaller, not louder, just present. I'm Kay. What's your name?" A pause, long enough that Patrick wondered if she wasn't going to answer. "Grace," the girl said. "Grace Faulkner." The air in the lobby changed. Patrick didn't understand why in that first second. He watched Officer Strom's expression shift. Not visibly, not to someone who wasn't looking for it, just a slight tightening around the eyes, a recalibration. She glanced at her partner, a brief look, barely a flicker, but Patrick caught it. He caught it because he'd been trained to catch it. "Grace Faulkner," Strom repeated, gently, just confirming. "Okay. Grace, are you with your dad? Your mom? Who were you with tonight?" "I was with my dad," Grace said. "At the apartment on Morrison. But I ran. There was a man in my room I didn't know, and I ran." Strom's partner had stepped away and was speaking quietly into his radio. Strom was still focused on Grace, still calm, still present. But something had shifted in the weight of the room, something Patrick could feel without being able to name it yet. "Okay," Strom said to Grace. "You did the right thing. You're safe now." She stood and turned to Patrick and lowered her voice. "Sir, can I see your ID again, please?" A full ID. Patrick handed over his driver's license. Strom looked at it. Her face did nothing. She handed it back. "Mr. Lane," she said, "I'm going to need you to sit tight for a few minutes. We're getting some additional units and a supervisor en route. Are you able to tell me more about the men in the alley?" 14 minimum, Patrick said. "Possibly 15. There was one in the parking garage stairwell on Mercer, level 3. Tactical dress, communications equipment, coordinated grid search. Whoever they are not amateurs, and they are not random." Strom nodded. "How'd you get the injury?" The man in the stairwell had a blade. "I got between it and the girl." Another nod. She looked at his arm with a clinical eye. "That needs attention. Ryan," she turned to the desk clerk, who startled slightly at being addressed by name. "Can you give me a first aid kit, please?" The next 40 minutes were a controlled, kind of organized chaos that Patrick had experienced before in different forms. The aftermath of events, the machinery of official response grinding into motion, the gradual multiplication of people and radios and questions. More squad cars arrived outside. An ambulance. two plainclothes detectives who arrived in an unmarked sedan and went to work quickly and without fanfare, the way people do when the name that's just come through on their radio has weight to it. A paramedic cleaned and dressed Patrick's forearm. The cut was 2.5 inches long and would need stitches, which he hadn't had time to think about until the paramedic showed him how deep it went, and he took one look and looked away. And while the paramedic worked, one of the plainclothes detectives sat beside him and asked him to walk through the evening from the beginning. Patrick walked through it. Clear, ordered, start to finish. The detective, young guy, maybe 35, sharp eyes that moved faster than the rest of his face, wrote notes and asked clarifying questions and did not give Patrick any information in return, which was standard and expected, and which Patrick accepted with patience he'd had to cultivate over years of working with people in official capacities. What was not standard was the second detective coming back from a phone call with an expression that had changed since she'd left to take it. She was maybe 50, short, solid, with reading glasses pushed up on her head that she kept forgetting about. Her name was Detective Arlene Stout, and Patrick would come to understand in the weeks and months ahead that she was one of the most tenacious investigators in the Pacific Northwest, a woman who had spent 26 years building cases that other people had given up on. He didn't know any of that yet. In that moment, he just knew that the way she was looking at him when she came back from that phone call was different from the way she'd looked at him before she left. Careful, precise, like she was seeing something that she needed to be very sure about before she said it. "Mr. Lane," she said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be patient with me, because I'm going to ask it in a way that might seem like it came from a different conversation." Patrick looked at her. "Okay, did your wife, your late wife, ever discuss her work at Faulkner Defense Systems with you in the weeks before she passed?" The lobby went very quiet in Patrick's head. Everything was still happening around him. The radio traffic, the paramedic finishing his dressing, Ryan the desk clerk answering a question from a uniformed officer, Grace sitting 10 feet away with a blanket someone had brought from somewhere around her shoulders. All of that was still there. But it receded, the way sound recedes when something inside you gets very loud. "Why?" Patrick said. Not as a question, exactly. Stout held his gaze. "Because we've had eyes on Richard Faulkner for 18 months, she said, keeping her voice low and level. And about 6 hours ago, we received information through a parallel federal investigation that documents central to that case may have had their origin with a Faulkner Defense employee who died in a vehicle accident 3 years ago." She paused. "A senior auditor named Helen Lane." The thing about a revelation that reorganizes your entire past is that it doesn't always feel the way you'd expect. Patrick had imagined, in dark moments over the years, the kind of 3 a.m. thoughts that come when Tucker's asleep and the apartment is too quiet, that if he ever found out that Helen's death wasn't an accident, he would come apart. He'd imagine rage, grief, reactivated and violent. What he felt, sitting in that hotel lobby at 2:40 in the morning with a freshly bandaged arm and wet boots and a 9-year-old girl wrapped in a blanket across the room, was something much quieter. It was the particular sensation of a locked room opening. "She was building a case," Patrick said. His voice came out flat, not because he was suppressing anything, but because the flatness was real. The calm of a man whose subconscious had been waiting for this specific piece of information without knowing it was waiting. "She was compiling something. She wouldn't tell me what. She said she needed to be sure first." Stout was writing. "Did she ever mention any specific documents? Names? Figures?" "No. She kept it separate from home. That was how she worked. She didn't bring the complications home. She protected us from the complications." He stopped. "She was protecting us, and I thought she was being careful. I didn't push." "Mr. Lane, who drove the truck," Patrick said. Stout looked at him. "I can't. I'm not asking you to make promises you can't keep," Patrick said. I'm asking you whether you know. Right now, do you know who drove the truck? A pause that was just long enough to be an answer in itself. We have a name, Stout said quietly. We've had it for about 4 hours. Across the lobby, Grace had fallen asleep against the side of the armchair they'd settled her in, the blanket pulled to her chin, her braid fully undone now, her hair loose and messy around her face. Ryan, the desk clerk, had turned the lobby's overhead lights down slightly without being asked, which was a kind thing to do. In the warmer light, she looked younger than 9. She looked like what she was, a child who had run 22 flights of stairs in the dark, because her instincts were better than whatever comfort she'd been promised. Patrick looked at her, and the thing that had been nagging at the edge of his recognition, the something in her face, the quality he couldn't name, sharpened suddenly into a thought that was so specific and so unwelcome that he sat with it for a moment without saying it out loud. He turned to Stout. Helen's documents, he said slowly. The ones that were taken from our house after she died. Were they? Did they name someone inside Faulkner's company? Someone who helped him construct the billing scheme? Stout looked at him with that careful expression. That's an active part of the investigation, Mr. Lane. I can't. I'm not asking about the investigation, he said. I'm asking about Helen's specific documents. She was an auditor. She would have cross-referenced accounts. She would have tracked the money to a name. Stout was quiet for a moment. She had a name, Stout said. Multiple names, but one that kept appearing as a primary facilitator. She paused. Richard Faulkner's former chief financial officer. A man named Dale Pruitt. Oh, wait, I shouldn't. She stopped, recalibrated. I can tell you it wasn't Faulkner himself who ran the accounting side. There was someone between him and the money. Patrick nodded slowly. He looked at Grace again. How long has Faulkner been divorced? He asked. Something in Stout's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. Why are you asking that? Because that girl, Patrick said carefully, looks like someone I used to know, and I'm trying to decide whether I'm letting grief make me see things that aren't there, or whether there's something you already know that I need to understand. Detective Arlene Stout set her notepad down on the table between them. She took her reading glasses off the top of her head, looked at them, and put them back. Mr. Lane, she said, I'm going to tell you something, and I'm going to tell you that it is not confirmed. It's a line of inquiry that was opened approximately 48 hours ago as part of a broader asset and background review of Faulkner and his associates. She folded her hands. Richard Faulkner's marriage to Lorraine Faulkner ended in 2018. The divorce was, by all accounts, contentious. There were allegations made by Lorraine Faulkner's attorneys that certain financial documents related to Faulkner's company had been accessed without authorization by a third party, a person they described as a company employee who had developed a personal relationship with Lorraine during that period. She stopped. That person was never named in the official filing. Patrick's hands were very still on the table. We don't know the full picture, Stout said, but the timeline of the documents Helen was compiling, it overlaps with something Lorraine Faulkner said to federal investigators 6 weeks ago. Something about the origin of the audit trail. And when we ran background on your wife's professional history, there were 2 years, 2017 and 2018, where her internal access of Faulkner defense was significantly above what her auditing role would have required. The silence stretched. Patrick looked at the sleeping girl across the lobby. He looked at the loose blonde hair. He looked at the line of her jaw, the specific way her brow creased slightly, even in sleep, the set of her shoulders, small but straight, even relaxed. Helen had always slept with straight shoulders. He used to tease her about it. She didn't know how to tell me, Patrick said. Not to Stout exactly. More to the room, to the night, to the 3 years of not knowing that were reorganizing themselves in real time inside his chest. She was trying to figure out how to tell me, and she was trying to make sure we were protected first, and she ran out of time. He let out a breath. "I need a minute," he said. "Of course," Stout said quietly. He walked to the window and looked out at Hargrove Place, still and wet and orange-lit. A police tape cordon now stretching across the alley entrance 40 feet north, 2 officers standing at it. In the distance, beyond the cordon, Patrick could see the blue-white sweeping of more official lights. More units arriving, the kind of response that a missing billionaire's daughter generated when the right names hit the right frequencies. He thought about Tucker asleep in their apartment, with the sitter on the pull-out couch, unaware that his father was standing in a hotel lobby with 2.5 inches of stitched-up forearm and a new understanding of his own life. He thought about Helen, about the laptop she used to close when he walked in, about the questions she asked him about encryption and document safety, about the way she'd said, "Let me be sure first," and the patience in her voice and the love underneath the patience. She had been trying to do the right thing. She had been trying to do it in a way that didn't get her family hurt. Richard Faulkner had made sure she ran out of time. And then he'd taken the documents she'd built and buried them. And then he'd gone on running his company and making his billions and sleeping through every night since with a clean conscience of a man who had decided that his survival was worth more than other people's lives. And now that man's daughter, maybe more than just his daughter, maybe was sleeping in an armchair in a hotel lobby because her own father had arranged her kidnapping as a legal strategy. Because even Grace, at 9 years old, was a resource to be deployed rather than a child to be loved. Patrick turned from the window. He walked back across the lobby and sat down beside Grace's chair. He didn't touch her, didn't wake her. He just sat close, the way he'd learned to sit close to Tucker after the nightmares, present but not intrusive. A landmark, something steady in the room. Stout watched him from across the lobby, her notepad open, her pen still. Dawn was beginning to build behind the eastern buildings. The orange of the streetlights was thinning, softening into the gray-blue of early morning, and the lobby's windows were beginning to lighten around their edges. Somewhere outside, a bird started. One bird, just calling into the pre-dawn, testing whether the world was ready to start again. At 5:47 a.m., Stout's phone rang. She answered it, listened for 45 seconds, said 3 words, "When did they?" and then was quiet for another 30 seconds. Then she hung up and came across the lobby to where Patrick was sitting. "Bryce Morrow," she said quietly, standing over him, keeping her voice below Grace's sleeping range. "Richard Faulkner's head of security. He was picked up 20 minutes ago attempting to leave Seattle-Tacoma Airport on a private charter. He had $260,000 in a carry bag and a one-way filed flight plan to Cancun." She paused. He talked. Patrick looked at her. "All of it," he said. "Enough of it," she said. "The staging of Grace's abduction. The financial arrangement. The names of the operatives in your alley tonight." She took a breath. And he confirmed, in writing, signed and witnessed, that the vehicle accident in March 2021 that killed your wife was not accidental. There are moments in a person's life that don't fully arrive until much later. Patrick Lane would have many of them in the weeks that followed. The morning the federal warrant was executed on Richard Faulkner's penthouse, the day he sat across from Lorraine Faulkner in a conference room, and she said things he hadn't prepared himself for, and he sat through them because she needed to say them. The first time Tucker asked him why the news kept mentioning their mom's name, and Patrick had to figure out how to explain the truth in a way that honored Helen without destroying Tucker's ability to function in the world. Those moments would come. In the lobby of the Carlisle Hotel, in the watery pre-dawn of November 15th, what Patrick did was this. He nodded once at Detective Stout, and then he looked down at the floor for a moment, and then he looked back up. "What happens to her?" he asked. He tilted his head toward Grace. "Lorraine Faulkner has been contacted," Stout said. "She's en route from Bellingham. She'll be here within the hour." "And Faulkner himself?" Federal agents are executing on the penthouse address as of 6 a.m. He won't be boarding anything. A pause. He's done, Mr. Lane. Patrick nodded again. Slower this time. The word done landing in his chest with a weight that was not triumphant and not hollow, but something more complex than either of those. The weight of finality, of a 3-year absence of justice suddenly ending, of a locked room not just opening, but being taken off its hinges entirely. Grace woke up at 6:20. She did it the way children sometimes wake from very deep sleep, all at once, eyes open, immediately present. And she turned her head and found Patrick sitting in the chair beside her, and she looked at him for a long moment without speaking. Then she said, "Is it morning?" "Almost," Patrick said. She looked at the windows, at the thin blue light coming through them. Then she looked back at him. "Your arm," she said. "Does it hurt?" "Not much anymore," he said, which was mostly true. The stitches itched. That was something he decided didn't need to be part of the conversation. "Thank you," Grace said, very simply, the way children offer gratitude, without caveat, without qualification, without any of the social scaffolding adults build around it. Patrick looked at her, at the specific arrangement of her face in the early light, the directness of her eyes, the composure that was not the composure of a trained person, but of a person with a naturally settled core. And he thought about Helen sitting across from him at that backyard card table in 2003, the specific quality of her attention, the way she could look at a thing and decide what she thought about it without a lot of unnecessary motion around the process. He didn't say what he was thinking. It was too large for a hotel lobby at 6 in the morning, and Grace was 9, and some conversations had to grow their roots before they could hold weight. "You did really well tonight," he said instead. Grace considered this assessment and seemed to find it accurate. "I was scared," she said. "You can be scared and do well at the same time," Patrick said. "Those aren't the same thing." She thought about that. Then she nodded. Lorraine Faulkner arrived at 7:14. She was a tall woman, early 40s, with the residue of beauty that hard years leave. Not diminished, exactly, but textured in a way that a photograph wouldn't catch. She came through the hotel entrance in a coat she'd clearly grabbed without thinking, still buttoning it. And when she saw Grace, she stopped walking for one full second before covering the last 20 feet in the kind of movement that is not quite running, but is everything that running is emotionally. She pulled her daughter in and held her, and Grace held back, and Patrick stood 6 feet away and gave them the full space of it. Stout came to stand beside him. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. After a while, Lorraine Faulkner raised her face from her daughter's hair and looked across the lobby at Patrick. Her eyes were full. She looked at his bandaged arm. She looked at his face. She couldn't seem to find words that fit the scale of what she wanted to say. She was never in danger, Patrick said, quietly enough that it was just for her. Not once I found her. Lorraine's chin did something complicated. She nodded. Then she reached out with one hand and touched Patrick's uninjured arm. A brief contact, a single breath of connection. And then she turned back to her daughter, and that was enough. That was honestly more than enough. Here is what the next 72 hours produced, for the record, for the people who need the shape of justice to be visible. Richard Faulkner was arrested at 6:08 a.m. on November 15th in the penthouse apartment on Morrison Street, while he was on a phone call with his attorneys that he would not be finishing. He was charged with conspiracy to commit fraud against the United States, obstruction of justice, and, after Bryce Morrow's written statement was cross-referenced with the findings from the federal investigation Dana Pruitt had been building for a year and a half, conspiracy to commit murder in the first degree. The driver of the box truck that killed Helen Lane was a man named Gary Posner, a former logistics contractor who had been paid through a series of shell accounts traceable, ultimately, to a fund controlled by Bryce Morrow. Posner had moved to Phoenix after the incident and had been running a small landscaping business. He learned about the warrant when two federal marshals knocked on his door at 7:30 on a Tuesday morning. He also talked. People who do things for money, in Patrick's experience, do not hold up the way people who do things for belief do. The money was gone. The silence had no further value. They talk. The documents Helen had been compiling, the original audit evidence she had built over 2 careful years at Faulkner Defense Systems, had not, as it turned out, been entirely destroyed. Helen was a meticulous woman who had grown up in an environment where things disappeared and had learned a plan for that. She had kept a secondary copy on an encrypted external drive that lived for 3 years inside a fireproof document safe in the storage unit Patrick had maintained on Dalton Road without ever fully sorting through Helen's work materials. He'd known the drive existed. He'd assumed it was personal files, accounting software backups, the routine detritus of a career. He'd never opened it. When federal investigators asked him about his wife's store materials and he told them about the storage unit, he drove them there himself on a gray November morning, Tucker in school, his arm still in its protective dressing, and he unlocked the unit and helped them carry out the boxes. When they found the drive and a forensic technician confirmed that its contents were intact and that their encryption hadn't degraded, one of the agents, a man who'd been doing this work for 15 years and didn't rattle easily, turned to Patrick and said, "Sir, this is a lot." Patrick looked at the drive, thought about Helen at the kitchen table, laptop open, coffee going cold. She was thorough, he said. The question of grace, of what she was specifically to Patrick, did not resolve in a single conversation. It resolved the way true things tend to resolve, in fragments and pieces over time, with patience and imperfect language and the occasional necessity of sitting in discomfort while a clearer picture forms. Lorraine Faulkner, 2 weeks after the night at the Carlisle, requested a meeting with Patrick through Stout. They met at a coffee shop on Maple Street. Neutral ground, no lawyers, just 2 people who had been orbiting a truth that belonged to both of them. Lorraine was composed, but not cold. She told Patrick, known about Helen. Not everything, but enough to have spent 3 years carrying a weight whose full shape she'd never understood. She told him that Grace's DNA, tested at Lorraine's own request as part of the civil proceedings she'd initiated against Richard Faulkner, had returned results that were being reviewed. She told him she didn't know what the right outcome was. She told him she only knew that Grace had come home from the Carlisle Hotel and asked about the man with the hurt arm 4 times in the first week, and that the asking had a quality that Lorraine recognized and respected. Patrick listened to all of this without speaking until she was finished. Then he said, "I don't want to complicate her life. Whatever those results say, I'm not here to complicate her life." Lorraine looked at him for a long moment. "I don't think you'd be a complication," she said. The results came back on a Wednesday in December, 3.5 weeks after the alley. Patrick got the call at 2 in the afternoon, standing in his kitchen, Tucker at school, the midwinter light pale and thin through the window over the sink. He'd been doing the dishes. He stood there with his hands wet and the phone to his ear, and the forensic coordinator read him the findings in the even, practiced language of someone who has delivered news like this many times and understands that the right approach is precision rather than drama. He thanked her. He set the phone down on the counter. He stood at the window for a long time, watching the bare tree in the yard across the street move in the wind. He thought about Helen. He thought about the 2 years she'd known and not known how to tell him. He thought about the questions she'd asked him about encryption and how he'd thought she was protecting him from her work complications, and how she'd actually been building a case that might, if she'd lived, have explained everything in the right sequence at the right time. He thought about a 9-year-old girl pressing herself into a stairwell corner and praying for something to change. He cried, "Finally, Standing at his kitchen sink with wet hands, he cried the way he hadn't cried since the hospital 3 years ago. Not violently, not loudly, just completely. The kind of crying that empties a particular room inside you that has been full for too long. Tucker came home from school at 3:30. He dropped his backpack by the door, ate an apple standing at the counter the way he always did, told Patrick about a math test he thought he'd done okay on, asked if they had any of the chips with the ridges left, and accepted the news that they did not, with the specific sorrow of a 10-year-old for whom chip availability is a genuine emotional event. Patrick watched him at the counter and felt the love he had for this boy. This loud, chip-mourning, excellent human being who carried Helen's eyes and his own stubbornness and had survived a thing that should have broken him. Felt it the way you feel sunlight when you've been inside too long. Physical. Real. Hey, Patrick said. Tucker looked up mid-apple. I need to talk to you about something. Not right now, after dinner, but something important. Tucker studied him. He was old enough to read his father's register, had been reading it since the age of 7 the way kids learn to read weather. Is it bad? He asked. No, Patrick said honestly. It's actually not bad at all. It's just a lot. Tucker considered this. Okay, he said. Then, because he was Tucker, are we still having pasta? Patrick laughed. Actually laughed, open-mouthed, the kind that surprised him. Yes, bud, we're still having pasta. Patrick Lane had his stitches removed on December 2nd. The attending physician, a compact, efficient woman at the urgent care clinic on Sycamore, looked at the healed line on his forearm and told him it had closed cleanly and would fade to a thin scar over time, maybe a year, possibly less, depending on his skin. She asked how he'd gotten it, and he said work-related, which was technically accurate. She said he'd done a decent job with the field dressing. He said he'd had some practice. He drove home through streets that were beginning to catch their first light dusting of December snow. Just a suggestion of it, really, not the real thing. The Northwest way of clearing its throat before winter, and he parked in the lot behind his building and sat in the truck for a minute before going up. The cracked taillight was still broken. He'd been meaning to fix that. He was going to fix it this weekend, he decided. He was going to fix the taillight and take Tucker to the hardware store and let him pick out the paint color for the bathroom the way he'd been asking to do since September. And then in the evening, they were going to watch whatever Tucker wanted on the couch and eat whatever food Tucker wanted. And Patrick was going to be fully, completely present for all of it. Because that was the thing about the kind of clarity that comes at the end of a long dark. It doesn't make you extraordinary. It just makes you honest. It shows you the ordinary things, and it says, look at this. This is what the whole thing was for. 3 weeks before Christmas, Patrick received a call from Detective Arlene Stout. She told him that the federal grand jury had returned indictments on all counts against Richard Faulkner. She told him the trial was expected to begin in the fall. She told him that his wife's documentation, the careful, patient, thorough audit evidence that Helen Lane had built over 2 years and protected even as the situation around her became dangerous, had been described by the lead federal prosecutor as the backbone of the government's case. She told him it would be acknowledged formally in the charging documents. Patrick thanked her. Mr. Lane, Stout said before she hung up, your wife knew what she was doing. She did it well. I know, Patrick said. He didn't know. He'd always known that about Helen. He just needed the rest of the world to catch up. The first time Grace came to visit, a Saturday in January, arranged carefully and gently between Lorraine and Patrick over a series of cautious conversations that both of them treated with the seriousness it deserved. She walked into his apartment and looked around with the particular evaluating attention of a child cataloging an unfamiliar space. She looked at the couch, the kitchen table, the row of Tucker's school pictures on the hallway wall, the faded area rug that Patrick had been meaning to replace for 2 years, the small shelf by the door where he kept his keys and his phone, and, for reasons he'd never fully analyzed, a photograph of Helen from 2012, The one taken at the park near their old house, where she was half turning toward the camera and laughing at something off frame. Grace stopped in front of the photograph. She looked at it for a long time. Patrick watched her from across the room, very still. She turned and looked at him. No particular expression, not distressed, not excited, not performing anything, just looking. The way she'd looked at him in the alley, from the stairwell corner, in the pale beam of his flashlight. That direct, unmediated attention. Then she said, "She looks like someone who is good at things." Patrick's throat did something. He said, "She was really good at things." Grace looked at the photograph one more time. Then she turned back to the room and asked if Tucker was home, because Lorraine had told her that Tucker had a video game that involved building cities, and Grace had decided this was something she needed to evaluate personally. Tucker was home. He came out of his room, assessed the situation. Small girl, around his age, standing in his living room with a direct expression and an apparent interest in urban planning simulations, and performed his own evaluation in approximately 4 seconds. "Do you actually want to play, or do you just want to tell me what to build?" he asked. Grace considered him. "Both," she said. Tucker nodded, as though this was the correct answer. "Okay," he said. "Come on." And just like that, with the particular ease that children have for accepting the new shape of the world when adults have done the hard work of building the bridge, they went down the hall to Tucker's room. And Patrick stood in his kitchen doorway and listened to his son's voice explaining the city-building mechanics and Grace's voice asking questions that were approximately 30% practical and 70% designed to redirect Tucker toward her preferred urban layout. And he thought about Helen and about Grace. Lowercase, the quality, not the name, though in this case they had become the same thing. And about the distance between the worst night of your life and the morning that comes after. That distance, it turns out, is not always a measure of time. Sometimes it's a measure of what you do with your body when someone else's worst night is happening. Sometimes it's a matter of being in the right stairwell at the right moment and making the right call in the 4 seconds you have to make it. Sometimes the whole of who you are, the training, the grief, the turkey sandwiches, the cracked tail light, the 4 hours of sleep, the way you learn to sit close without intruding, the person you loved and lost and are still, even now, in quiet conversation with. Sometimes all of that converges into a single moment in a dark alley, and you either step forward or you don't. Patrick Lane stepped forward. He bled for a child he didn't know, and in doing so, he found something he hadn't known was still out there waiting to be found. If you're watching this, if you've sat with this story through all its darkness and all its turns, then you already understand something that took Patrick a long time to arrive at, that the people we love don't fully leave when they leave. Helen Lane had been gone for 3 years when her careful work finally found its way into the light. She had been protecting her family all along. She'd just run out of road before she could tell them how. But the road found its way home anyway. That's what this story is. And if you have someone in your life right now, someone who's doing something careful and quiet that you don't fully understand yet, maybe let them know you see it. Maybe ask. Maybe don't wait for them to be sure first, because sometimes being sure takes longer than any of us have. If this story moved you, if it stayed with you the way the stories worth staying with do, we'd love for you to share it with someone who needs it. Drop a comment below and tell us what moment hit you hardest. And if you're new here to Crest Stories, welcome. We have a lot more of these waiting for you. Stay close. We'll see you in the next one.